Hi guys. Um, I wanted to make this week's video on the FRQ that I posted on Blackboard on a Charles Dickens piece called Hard Times. Um, this is a pretty traditional style FRQ, prose FRQ. I'm not sure what the prompt is for the actual AP test is going to look like, but I am fairly certain there's going to be some prose involved in it. It might be a blend of two different FRQs. But I thought since Dickens is an author we've already studied, that this might be a good one to practice for today's kind of lesson. I want you to take what you can from this. If you're taking the AP test, I highly recommend writing this FRQ and timing yourself with the 40 minutes because you are going to have to stick to the time. Now, most of you, I'm perfectly fine with the time that we've done timed FRQs before, but it is something you're still going to want to consider practicing. Also keep in mind that if you're taking the AP test, there are going to be 2 days, 2 separate sessions that they're going to be doing the test, an earlier one and a later one. So know that. And also, if you had signed up to take the test and you don't feel comfortable anymore and you don't feel that you need to take it or you don't want to take it, if you contact College Board, from what I understand, you can get a refund. So those are some things to consider moving forward. Okay, so today's prompt reads as, under the directions, read the following passage from Dickens' novel Hard Times carefully. Then in an essay, describe the author's attitude towards Mr. Gradgrind and the ways in which it is conveyed. Consider diction, selection of detail, use of allusion, and syntax. So I wrote those words down on my paper, selection of detail, diction, use of allusion, and syntax, because as I was reading, I wanted to be able to watch out for them. It's not saying you can only talk about those things, obviously, but keep in mind of what we're using those things to understand. How the author portrays Mr. Gradgrind. So Mr. Gradgrind is the character. How does the author portray him? Also, it's important to note this is a passage, right? This is not a full short story. That's something that I have seen FRQs before being the entire text of a short story, and that changes the reading. So you really have to make sure that you recognize if it's an excerpt or if it's a full piece. Okay, so let's read through it. And as we're reading, I want you to notice the little citations, the footnotes at the bottom here. Because generally speaking, when I see an FRQ that has that, it's because it matters. Okay, so let's start. Mr. Gradgrind walked homeward from the school in a state of considerable satisfaction. It was his school, and he intended to be a model. He intended every child in it to be a model, just as the young Gradgrinds were all models. There were 5 young Gradgrinds, and they were models every one. They had been lectured at from their tenderest years, coursed like little hares. Almost as soon as they could run alone, they had been made to run to the lecture room. The first object with which they had an association, or of which they had remembrance, was a large black board with a dry ogre, chalking ghastly white figures on it. Not that they knew by name or nature anything about an ogre. Fact forbid, I only use the words to express a monster in a lecturing castle, with heaven knows how many heads manipulated into one, taking childhood captive and dragging it into gloomy statistical dens by the hair. Okay, I'm going to end line 21 here and kind of reflect back what I'm seeing. Because as we know, we work chronologically through text anyway. So we obviously know the focus of this is Mr. Gradgrind. The speaker seems to be writing in first person because we have I. But the speaker is not Mr. Gradgrind. The narrator does not seem to be particularly fond of Mr. Gradgrind. If anything, if I was writing in the margins, I might write something about having kind of like a sarcastic, over dramatic tone. Um, because the way that the kids and Mr. Gradgrind are described seems kind of impossible. That they had to be models, and the repetition of them being models. He under line 4, he intended every child in it to be a model, and then the young Gradgrinds were all models. And then it goes into the description of the Gradgrinds, and that they were all kind of like perfect little hares running to the meeting house. Then we have this allusion to an ogre, and that comes from, I don't want to say fairy tales, but generally, like, it's almost as if Mr. Gradgrind would have no business discussing ogres. That was almost like not worth his time and his sensibility. So the narrator seems to not be the biggest fan of Mr. Gradgrind. Exclamations like "fact forbid" on line 16 only highlight that sarcasm more. He says, "I only use the word to express a monster in a lecturing castle, with heaven knows how many heads manipulated into one, taking childhood captive." Which seems to be that is how he's describing Mr. Gradgrind. He is the monster in a lecturing castle, with heaven knows how many heads manipulated into one. Okay, so there's that kind of comparison to Mr. Gradgrind himself being an ogre. Then we move on to the second third here, and I'm going to stop at line 48. "No little Gradgrind had ever seen face in the moon. It was up in the moon before it could speak distinctly. No little Gradgrind had ever learned the silly jingle, twinkle, twinkle, little star. How I wonder what you are. No little Gradgrind had ever known wonder on the subject. Each little Gradgrind, having a 5 years old, dissected the Great Bear like a Professor Owen, and driven Charles Wayne like a locomotive engine driver. No little Gradgrind had ever associated a cow in a field with that famous cow with the crumpled horn, who tossed the dog, who worried the cat, who killed the rat, who ate the malt, or with that yet more famous cow, who swallowed Tom Thumb. It had never heard of those celebrities, and had only been introduced to a cow as graminivorous, ruminating quadruped with several stomachs." All right, I'm going to stop there, actually. The selection of detail here is quite comical, which only highlights that sarcasm. The Gradgrind children, it's almost laughable that they would actually have a childhood. They couldn't possibly learn the silly jingle, twinkle, twinkle, little star like the kids they are, because they're too busy actually like dissecting and studying constellations, which is, they see the star, they see actual stars. And then there's this bit, this almost like nursery rhyme on line 31. "No little Gradgrind had ever associated with a cow in a field with that famous cow with the crumpled horn, who tossed the dog, who worried the cat, who killed the rat, who ate the malt, or with the yet more famous cow who swallowed Tom Thumb." Those are all references to like children's rhymes. That would just be laughable. So in this kind of this rhyme, or this piece that we have this allusion to, we do get a sense of that the speaker is making fun of just how serious Mr. Gradgrind and the children are or are forced to be. And a lot of really good diction to describe the silliness of it all, like graminivorous, quadruped. There's some language here that, because of the words that are chosen, it only makes Mr. Gradgrind seem that much more ridiculous. Now I'm moving to line 40 and going to the end. "To his matter-of-fact home, which was called Stone Lodge, Mr. Gradgrind directed his steps. He had virtually retired from the wholesale hardware trade before he built Stone Lodge, and was now looking about for a suitable opportunity of making an arithmetical figure in Parliament. Stone Lodge was situated on a moor, within a mile or two of a great town called Coketown in the present Faithful guidebook." I think this is interesting because we've gone from talking to the children now to we have a shift here to his actual home. "A very regular feature on the face of the country, Stone Lodge was, excuse me, let me read that again. A very regular feature on the face of the country Stone Lodge was. Not the least disguised toned down or shaded off the uncompromising fact in the landscape. A great square house with a heavy portico darkening the principal windows, as its master's heavy brows overshadowed his eyes. A calculated, cast-up, balanced, improved house. 6 windows at the side at the door, 6 on that side, a total of 12 in this wing, a total of 12 in the other wing, 4 and 20 carried over to the back wings, a lawn and a garden and an infant avenue, all ruled straight like a botanical account book. When we get to this last section, it really does seem to be a depiction that the home is used to depict the behavior or the personality of Mr. Gradgrind. They mention that line on line, I think it's 58, a heavy portico darkening the principal windows as its master's heavy brows overshadowed his eyes. His house is a reflection of who he is. And so those details that happen from line like 61 all the way to the end just shows the kind of the blending of his personality and the home that he resides in. Okay, so if you kind of split those into thirds, you can start to see some of those changes. We go from the description of the children's education to their childhood, and then the home in which Mr. Gradgrind lives. So if I was thinking about this and I was trying to decide how diction, selection of detail, allusion, and syntax are used to characterize the author's attitude towards Mr. Gradgrind, I really think the author's attitude towards Mr. Gradgrind is one of sarcastic criticism, because he's so tightly wound and everything has to be very mathematical and very perfect. And so because of it, he doesn't actually allow the children to have a childhood. So if I'm making my list of tone and diction, I want to consider, like, okay, if I'm looking at tone, if I'm looking at diction, how do they help his purpose? So in here, if the tone of it is sarcastic, and we pick, we're able to select language that kind of shows that level of criticism and sarcasm that the speaker has, that helps our point. So if it was me, what I would be doing is I'd be splitting this into thirds, and I'd talk about the first section, and I would work through the first section and discuss what seems to be the most significant there. So if it was me, I might, end at line 14, maybe line 21, and I might start by describing the author's attitude in general and how diction is clear, because Dickens is very specific with his word choice all the time in everything that he writes. That's why his writing tends to be so long. But some of the sarcastic language that he uses is talking about the Gradgrinds being models, their little hairs, a dry ogre chalking ghastly white figures on it. Some of these even selection of details only make Mr. Gradgrind seem that much more ridiculous. And then we move on to the Gradgrind's education on line 22, of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And here, what seems to be the most important thing to address would be the use of allusion here. References to the Great Bear, Professor Owen, Charles Wayne, Tom Thumb, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, all of those things are meant to show the difference between the Gradgrind children's education and the lack of childhood that they've had. Because Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and Tom Thumb are for childhood, like nursery rhymes, whereas Great Bear, Professor Owen, Charles Wayne, that is much more would be much more the concerns of somebody who was an adult that wanted to study. And again, we've got that word choice down there at the bottom, the diction on the last 2 lines. Graminivorous, ruminating quadruped with several stomachs. That is definitely not a sentence that a child would necessarily choose to write. Okay, so I would talk primarily about the allusion here. And then when I would get to the last section, this is where I might shift to discussing maybe even more the use of detail for comparison, because we've got excuse me, because we've got Mr. Gradgrind here, the house being described in a way that is symbolic of Mr. Gradgrind, and even more than symbolic, because Dickens comes right out and says that it is basically the physical manifestation of its owner, Mr. Gradgrind. One thing to also remember about Dickens, if you encounter Dickens on the actual test, is that he often used names to represent like emotions, or they were symbolic of that character. So for example, Miss Havisham, or Pip, like those names could often be connected to aspects of their personality. So when I see a name like Mr. Gradgrind, it doesn't sound like a particularly friendly person. That is not the name that you would typically see as a friendly person. If you look at Pumblechook from I can't even remember it right now. Great Expectations. From Great Expectations, Pumblechook is a ridiculous figure, and you can see that clearly featured in his name. So those kind of name conventions, that those can be worthy things to mention when you're analyzing. Okay, so we don't want to obviously structure our paragraphs on the devices that we're going to talk about, but you do want to start with what is coming across, what is being described, as you're kind of opening. So if in the beginning what's being described is the nature of Mr. Gradgrind and his relationship with his children, then the next section might be his desire for them not to have a traditional childhood, and then, the description of his home, and then connecting it to those devices. So I think it's worthy to really take a look also at syntax. So I might talk more about syntax in the last third, but some of the things that if you were to address syntax, you can always kind of talk about is there element of repetition? Is there parallel structure? Is there a strange word order? So for example, on line 49, a very regular feature on the face of the country Stone Lodge was. It's a little bit weird of a construction there, because usually it would be Stone Lodge was a very regular feature on the face of the country, but he doesn't say it like that. He switches the construction of the sentence around. Does he do that for a particular purpose? Does that affect it at all? And there's lots of repetition, like the nursery rhyme around line 25. In the last, or the first two paragraphs there, we've got a lot of repetition. Is that for the sake of attention? Are we supposed to be paying attention to that? Or is it to kind of mimic the lack of childhood that the children have been able to have? Okay, so my recommendation, like I said, is to write this FRQ. And if you ever want any feedback on what you have written, so I can tell you if you're heading in the right direction, I can do that for you. Organization of your thoughts is really, really important in this particular FRQ. You can't just rant and rave about stylistic devices. You have to connect these to central things that are being accomplished as we move chronologically through the text. And I'll talk about it in our conversation tomorrow, but if you want me to do a FRQ walkthrough where I actually write an FRQ on a camera, that might be a long video, but I certainly can do that for you. All right, if you have any questions, just let me know and I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Bye.